Earth had been present at the edge of the galactic order for less than 30 standard years when the demand arrived, carried by a relay probe that translated itself into every major human language at once, calm and absolute, stating that humanity was expected to comply with the authority of the core assembly, to restrict fleet construction, to submit all long-range weapons research for inspection, and to accept a permanent supervisory delegation placed in orbit over Earth and Mars. And the message framed this as a kindness, a chance to be protected and guided, because the Assembly had decided that humans were energetic but immature, ambitious but undisciplined, and far too dangerous to be left fully sovereign. And in the Great Chamber of the United Earth Council, the reaction was quiet rather than explosive, because humans had already learned that the galaxy watched how new species reacted under pressure, and silence could be more unsettling than anger. So President Allen Brooks listened without comment, while advisors murmured data projections and military officers studied probability curves. And when the transmission ended, Brooks simply said that the Assembly would receive a reply after proper consideration, which was a delayed tactic the aliens mistook for hesitation, because beyond human space, the core Assembly had already classified Earth as compliant, another young world that would fold when faced with overwhelming precedent, and in the halls of the Assembly, alien. Delegates joked openly about the stubborn mammals who would soon learn their place, with one avian counselor remarking that humans reminded him of early flightless prey animals that kicked wildly before exhaustion, while another, a scaled strategist named Kethral, warned that humans had shown an unusual rate of adaptation in simulated conflicts, a warning that was logged and ignored. Because the Assembly had ruled for millennia and descending assessments rarely slowed its momentum, and so enforcement fleets began to move, vast formations intended not for war, but for demonstration, designed to hover at the edge of human territory like an unblinking eye. While back on Earth, the delay Brooks requested was used to activate something that had never been shared with the galaxy, a contingency buried beneath layers of civilian infrastructure and economic planning, because humanity had learned its harshest lessons long before the stars, lessons about what happened when power was centralized elsewhere. And Admiral Holt stood in a subterranean command complex beneath Nevada, explaining to a small group of civilian leaders that the Assembly's demand was not about safety but control, that inspection regimes always preceded dependency, and dependency always preceded irrelevance. And she spoke plainly without rhetoric, stating that if Earth accepted supervision now, humanity would never be allowed parity later. And the room understood this not as a theory, but as history repeating on a larger scale. And when Brooks asked what refusal would mean, Holt answered that refusal would mean escalation, sanctions, limited strikes, and eventually a demonstration attack meant to force obedience, because that was how the Assembly maintained order, by breaking one world just enough to teach the others. And Brooks asked whether humanity could survive that lesson, and Holt replied that survival was not the goal, deterrence was, because the galaxy believed humans lacked reach, that their ships were few and their technology derivative, and that belief was a true vulnerability, because beneath civilian trade lanes and exploration missions, humanity had built something else, not a fleet meant to conquer territory, but a system designed to touch everything at once, a network of autonomous platforms seeded slowly over decades under the cover of scientific cooperation, each one legal on its own, benign when inspected, but together capable of reshaping the balance of power. And this system had a name that never left the room, spoken once and then never repeated, because names had power, and as enforcement fleets crossed into the outer Heliopause broadcasting warnings, Earth sent its reply, a simple message acknowledging the Assembly's concern and declining supervision, stating that humanity would remain responsible for its own defense and development. And the response from the Assembly was immediate and cold, declaring Earth in violation of Galactic stability accords and authorizing limited corrective action, which in Assembly terms meant precision strike on a symbolic target, enough to shatter confidence without provoking total war. And the chosen target was a shipyard orbiting Luna, carefully selected to avoid mass casualties while still sending a message. And when the strike came, it was swift and surgical, a beam lancing across space and tearing through unfinished hulls, scattering debris in a silent cloud. And across the galaxy, analysts nodded, satisfied that the lesson had begun. But on Earth, the reaction was not panic. It was confirmation, because Holt watched the impact feed and said quietly that the Assembly had done exactly what human models predicted, and that meant the next step was justified. and Brooks authorized it with a single sentence that did not mention revenge or pride, only necessity, and far from Earth, in regions the Assembly considered secure. Things began to change in ways that censors struggled to interpret because dormant platforms shifted orientation, communication delays shortened, and energy readings flickered just above background noise, dismissed at first as cosmic variance, until a junior analyst on a core assembly monitoring station noticed a pattern and flagged it for review, only to be told that human technology could not possibly influence systems that far inside assembly space. And while that reassurance circulated, humanity's ambassadors quietly withdrew from minor outposts. Scientists returned home, trade vessels altered routes, and to outside observers it looked like retreat, like a species pulling inward under pressure. But beneath the surface the system Holt had described was aligning, not toward borders or fleets, but toward nodes of influence, relay nexuses, command arrays, and data cores that formed the nervous system of the galactic order, because humanity had studied not how the Assembly fought wars, but how it governed peace, and when the first Assembly relay went dark without explosion or warning, simply ceasing to exist as a functioning structure, confusion rippled outward faster than any weapon, and for the first time in centuries the core assembly faced a problem it could not immediately classify, because Earth had not struck a fleet or a world. It had struck the galaxy's heart, and this was only the beginning. The sudden loss of the relays sent a wave of uncertainty through the core assembly, not because a single structure mattered, but because relays were assumed inviolable, layered with redundancy and guarded by doctrines that had not failed in 1,000 cycles. And when technicians confirmed that the station was neither destroyed nor sabotaged in any conventional sense, but simply non-functional at a fundamental level, the Assembly convened an emergency session where confusion bled into irritation, and irritation quickly hardened into anger directed at humanity, because no other species had both motive and recent provocation. And yet even then the dominant belief was that this was a fluke, an accident, or a limited act meant to signal defiance rather than capability. So Kethral again warned that humans were behaving asymmetrically, attacking systems rather than forces. But senior counselors dismissed the concern and authorized a second demonstration strike, this time closer to Earth's population centers, believing escalation would restore the hierarchy. While on Earth, Admiral Holt reviewed cascading reports that showed the system performing within predicted margins, each platform acting independently yet coherently, exploiting maintenance protocols and shared standards the Assembly itself had mandated, because humanity had noticed that galactic unity required uniformity, and uniformity created single points of failure. And Holt explained to her staff that the system did not destroy infrastructure but rewrote its priorities, starving key nodes of synchronization until they collapsed under their own complexity, a method designed not to kill but to paralyze. And when the second strike arrived, it targeted a coastal power distribution hub, causing widespread outages but limited casualties, and the Assembly broadcast the footage across known space as a warning, framing it as restraint. Proof of mercy of compliance followed, yet the reaction among humans was not submission but grim resolve, because the strike confirmed that the Assembly would keep hurting civilians until obedience was achieved, and that meant restraint was no longer an option. And President Brooks addressed the world in plain language, stating that humanity had been given a choice between slow erasure and immediate resistance, and that choice had been made, and he did not promise safety or victory, only that humanity would decide its own fate. And as the speech ended, the system expanded its reach, activating layers that had been dormant even from most human planners, because compartmentalization was another lesson learned early, and across assembly space more relays faltered, navigation beacons drifted out of alignment, and fleet coordination degraded as time stamps slipped out of phase, causing ships to miss rendezvous points by microseconds that translated into thousands of kilometers at relativistic speeds. And commanders began to report near collisions and aborted maneuvers, problems no amount of discipline could fully correct, and panic began to seep into lower levels of assembly command as orders contradicted each other and communication delays grew unpredictable, and still the Assembly refused to acknowledge the scale of the threat, instead accelerating its timetable for Earth subjugation, ordering a coalition fleet to assemble for a decisive show of force, unaware that humanity had no intention of meeting that fleet head-on, because the goal was never to win a battle. It was to make the idea of control untenable, and as the coalition fleet struggled to form amid growing logistical chaos, A realization dawned too late among a few perceptive alien strategists that Earth was not asking to be left alone through words or treaties. It was enforcing that condition through the architecture of the galaxy itself, turning the Assembly's greatest strength, its interconnected order, into a weapon against it. And with every silent failure, the balance shifted further, drawing the galaxy toward a reckoning it had never imagined, one where obedience could no longer be assumed. As the coalition fleet attempted to marshal its forces, the cracks widened into chasms, because coordination on a galactic scale depended on trust in timing, routing, and authority, and each of those pillars was eroding simultaneously. So admirals argued over which orders were valid, while logistics officers rerouted supplies that never arrived, and in the assembly chamber the mood shifted from certainty to accusation, with delegates demanding to know which species had failed in maintenance or security, because the idea that a single upstart civilization could inflict systemic paralysis was still emotionally unacceptable, and Kethral pressed again for a strategic pause, arguing that escalation only fed an enemy that thrived on overreaction. But the vote went against him, and authorization was granted for a punitive campaign meant to end the matter decisively. And when the first elements of the coalition fleet finally moved toward human space, they did so fragmented and poorly synchronized, a reality hidden from public broadcasts but obvious to anyone watching internal feeds. And Earth saw this clearly, because human analysts were no longer blind observers but active participants inside the galactic information flow, reading delays and distortions like weather patterns. And Admiral Holt explained to President Brooks that the Assembly was now trapped by its own image, unable to stop without admitting vulnerability, and therefore guaranteed to keep pushing until the cost became undeniable. And Brooks authorized the next phase, one that shifted from infrastructure perception, because power was sustained not just by function but by belief. And across the galaxy, rumors began to spread faster than official statements. Reports of ships lost not to enemy fire but to navigational failures, of worlds cut off for days at a time, of assembly directives arriving too late to matter. And these rumors were not fabricated. They were curated, amplified subtly by human systems that nudge probability rather than dictating outcomes, allowing the truth to travel where censorship could not fully reach. And on distant worlds, client species began to ask quiet questions about the wisdom of absolute obedience, while on Earth the population adapted to a war that did not look like war, conserving energy, decentralizing production, and accepting disruptions with a calm born of shared purpose. And this resilience was noted by alien observers with growing unease, because the expected collapse of morale never came, and when the coalition fleet finally crossed into the outer reaches of human controlled space, it found no grand offensive line, no challenge broadcast, only silence and empty orbits, which some commanders took as confirmation of human weakness, pushing forward aggressively, unaware that the silence was deliberate, a vacuum created to isolate them from the systems they relied on. And as they advanced deeper, their coordination worsened, squadrons drifting apart, command ships losing contact with escorts, until the fleet resembled a scattered migration rather than a unified force. And it was then that the first human warships appeared, not in overwhelming numbers, but with precise timing, striking isolated elements with efficient brutality, and withdrawing before coherent responsive form. And these engagements were brief and devastating, revealing technology optimized for disruption rather than spectacle. And as reports of losses filtered back through delayed channels, of psychological impact far exceeded the material damage, because for the first time assembly crews understood that they were not facing a defiant child but a patient adversary that had studied them deeply. And in the assembly chamber, a terrible clarity began to form among a few delegates that humanity had never expected to win permission to exist on equal terms. It had decided instead to make dominance obsolete, and the galaxy was only beginning to grasp the consequences of that decision. By the time the Assembly acknowledged that the coalition fleet was no longer a symbol of authority but a liability, the damage to its prestige had already spread beyond containment, because worlds that had once measured safety by proximity to Assembly power now saw that power stumble and bleed without understanding why, and fear began to shift direction away from Earth and toward the institutions that claimed to control it. And in private channels, client governments asked whether compliance still guaranteed protection, or merely tied them to a failing system, while Assembly leadership debated responses that ranged from total war to negotiated de-escalation, none of which could be pursued cleanly in an environment where communication itself was unreliable, and Kethrall finally secured authorization for a limited dialogue attempt, not out of goodwill but necessity, dispatching envoys through slower, less integrated routes in hopes of bypassing the disruption, and when the message reached Earth, it was received without celebration, because Admiral Holt warned that dialogue was another battlefield, one where the Assembly would probe for weakness, and President Brooks agreed to respond only through open channels, stating clearly that humanity would not accept supervision, punishment, or conditional sovereignty, and that any future relationship would be based on mutual non-interference, a concept that unsettled the Assembly more than outright defiance, because it implied a galaxy without a central arbiter, and as talks stalled, the conflict entered a new phase marked by cascading failures within Assembly space that could no longer be blamed on human action alone, because once synchronization broke down, secondary systems began to fail autonomously, creating feedback loops that human planners had predicted but could not fully control. And Holt authorized selective stabilization efforts in regions where collapse risked mass civilian harm, not out of mercy alone, but strategy, because allowing the Assembly to frame humanity as indiscriminately destructive would unify opposition. And these quiet interventions went largely unnoticed, but analysts on several worlds observed that outages ended abruptly without explanation, and suspicion began to turn inward, questioning whether the Assembly itself was concealing the truth. And meanwhile, the Coalition fleet continued to degrade, its commanders now more concerned with survival and extraction than victory. And when one task force attempted an unsanctioned withdrawal, it was not punished by Earth, but simply allowed to leave, a decision that sent shockwaves through Assembly ranks, because it suggested that humanity was not interested in conquest or annihilation, only in redefining the rules. And that realization was perhaps the most destabilizing of all, because it left the Assembly without a narrative that justified its own escalation. And as dissent grew louder within its chamber, older species began to recall why the Assembly had been formed in the first place, to prevent cycles of domination from destroying stability. And now it faced the irony that its methods had created the very threat it claimed to suppress. And as the galaxy edged closer to a tipping point, humanity waited, not in triumph but in grim focus, because striking the galaxy's heart had never been about revenge. It had been about forcing a future where obedience was no longer assumed, and the cost of that future was still unfolding. The internal fracture of the Assembly accelerated as member worlds began acting independently to protect their own interests, rerouting trade, hoarding resources, and quietly pulling support from joint enforcement measures. And this decentralization, once unthinkable, became unavoidable as the Assembly's directives lost coherence, arriving late or contradicting previous orders. And in many regions, local commanders chose pragmatism over loyalty, standing down fleets rather than risk total loss in a conflict whose logic no longer held, while Assembly media attempted to project control by blaming saboteurs and promising imminent resolution, a message that rang hollow as disruptions continued. And on Earth, this fragmentation was tracked carefully, because Admiral Holt understood that collapse was not victory unless it stabilized into something less dangerous, and she convened a council of military planners, economists, and sociologists to assess secondary effects, warning that power vacuums bred warlords as easily as freedom, and that humanity would be judged not only by how it fought, but by what followed. And President Brooks authorized a controversial directive allowing limited transparency, releasing evidence of Assembly actions and failures through neutral academic and commercial channels, framed not as propaganda, but as documentation, trusting that facts would undermine myths more effectively than threats. And across the galaxy, scholars and analysts began piecing together the pattern, realizing that humanity had exploited systemic dependence rather than brute force, and that the Assembly's assumption of eternal compliance had blinded it to its own fragility. And as understanding spread, so did restraint, with several major species publicly calling for a cessation of hostilities and an emergency restructuring summit, a proposal that would have been dismissed weeks earlier, but now gained traction as fleets limped home and economies strained. And in the midst of this shifting landscape, the Coalition fleet finally fractured beyond repair, its remaining elements retreating or surrendering to neutral ports, and Earth chose not to pursue them, a decision that baffled hardliners but reinforced the emerging narrative that humanity sought autonomy, not dominion, and this restraint altered perceptions more powerfully than any battle because it contrasted sharply with the Assembly's history of punitive enforcement, and in private correspondence some. Alien leaders admitted fear not of human weapons, but of human patience, the willingness to endure uncertainty and delay gratification in pursuit of long-term leverage, a trait the galaxy had underestimated. And as Assembly leadership convened what would become its most consequential session, facing demand for reform from within and pressure from without, humanity prepared for the next phase, knowing that striking the galaxy's heart had only opened the door, and that what followed would determine whether the galaxy learned cooperation or descended into chaos. As the Assembly session unfolded behind closed channels, the weight of accumulated failure pressed down on its delegates, because for the first time in its long history, compliance could no longer be enforced by habit or fear, and proposals that once would have been dismissed as radical now dominated the agenda, including devolving authority, dismantling centralized enforcement fleets, and acknowledging the sovereignty of emerging powers without conditional oversight. And each proposal was met with resistance from older blocs that had benefited most from the existing order, creating a paralysis that mirrored the systemic failures outside the chamber. And it was in this moment of internal deadlock that humanity made its most unexpected move, not by escalating disruption, but by reducing it, selectively restoring synchronization to key civilian networks across multiple regions, an act that could not be hidden and immediately sparked confusion, because it contradicted the Assembly narrative of a relentless aggressor, and analysts quickly realized that the restorations were conditional, tied to regions where local authorities had publicly called for de-escalation and reform, and this linkage sent a clear message without a single threat spoken, demonstrating that stability was possible without submission. And on Earth, Admiral Holt briefed the leadership that this phase was the most dangerous, because relief could breed complacency, and opponents might interpret restraint as weakness. But Brooks agreed that the risk was necessary, because the goal was not to rule a broken galaxy, but to survive within a changed one. And as restored systems came back online, commerce resumed and communications cleared, allowing suppressed debates to surface openly. And across the galaxy, populations demanded explanations from their leaders about why obedience had nearly cost them everything. And these pressures forced Assembly delegates into public accountability for the first time, fracturing long-standing power coalitions. And when the Assembly finally issued a formal request for talks under neutral mediation, it did so without demands or ultimatums, a signal that its confidence had been irrevocably shaken, and humanity accepted, insisting that discussions be broadcast openly to all member worlds, a condition that stripped the Assembly of its ability to control narrative. And as preparations began, many feared that this transparency would inflame tensions, but the opposite occurred, because hearing leaders speak without scripted certainty revealed shared anxieties rather than alien malice, and the image of humanity shifted again, from disruptive force to catalyst, a species that had forced a reckoning not through conquest, but through exposure. And yet beneath this cautious optimism, Holt remained vigilant, reminding her staff that systems once destabilized rarely return to their original state, and that factions unwilling to accept a diminished Assembly might still resort to violence. And so human defenses remain active, though less visible, ready to respond if the galaxy chose regression over reform. And as the date for the talks approached, it became clear that the galaxy stood at a crossroads, one defined not by who held the most ships, but by who could adapt to a future where obedience was no longer the foundation of order. When the talks began, they unfolded not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a slow unmasking of assumptions that had guided galactic politics for generations. Because with every exchange it became clear that the Assembly had relied less on explicit force than on the shared belief that no alternative existed, and once that belief cracked, the machinery of control lost much of its power, and human representatives spoke rarely and plainly, avoiding grand speeches, and focusing instead on specific principles, non-interference, reciprocal transparency, and the right of worlds to refuse integration without punishment. And this restraint unsettled many delegates who were accustomed to rhetoric and dominance, because it left little room to maneuver or misinterpret. And as sessions were broadcast across inhabited space, populations reacted in unpredictable ways, some fearful of instability, others energized by the possibility of self-determination. And on several worlds, local governments faced protests demanding withdrawal from Assembly enforcement pacts, while others called for new regional alliances independent of the old core. And this surge of political motion created pressure that no central authority could fully suppress. And within the Assembly itself, fractures hardened into blocks, reformists arguing that survival required adaptation, and hardliners insisting that concession would invite chaos. And it was during one such deadlock session that news arrived of an unauthorized strike by a hardline fleet against a neutral system suspected of cooperating with humanity, an act meant to provoke retaliation and restore fear, and the galaxy held its breath waiting for Earth's response, because this moment would define whether humanity truly sought a different order or merely a subtler dominance, and Admiral Holt advised immediate defensive readiness but no retaliation, explaining that responding as expected would validate the hardliners' narrative, and President Brooks agreed, authorizing instead the release of incontrovertible evidence linking the strike to its perpetrators along with a full restoration of disrupted systems in the affected region. And this response landed with crushing effect, because it exposed the hardliners without granting the conflict they desired. And within days, several Assembly member worlds formally censured the rogue commanders, an act unprecedented in Assembly history. And as trust slowly rebuilt through transparency rather than coercion, the realization spread that the galaxy had crossed a threshold, that power could no longer be exercised invisibly or without consent, and humanity's role in this shift became a subject of intense debate, admired by some, resented by others, but no longer dismissed, and through it all Earth maintained its posture guarded engagement, neither retreating nor advancing, because Holt understood that the most dangerous phase of any transformation was the one where old structures collapsed faster than new ones formed, and vigilance, not triumph, would determine whether the galaxy's heart could heal after being struck so deeply. The conclusion came not with a single treaty or proclamation, but with a gradual realignment that marked the end of an era and the uncertain birth of another, because after the failed provocation and its exposure, the Assembly could no longer pretend that unity could be enforced without consent, and in the months that followed, its authority was formally redefined, shrinking from a ruling body into a coordinating forum whose power rested on voluntary participation rather than coercive reach. And, while some worlds withdrew entirely, others chose regional compacts that better reflected their needs, creating a patchwork galaxy far messier but also more resilient than before. And throughout this transition, humanity remained deliberately restrained, deactivating the last intrusive elements of its system once reforms reached irreversible momentum, proving that the disruption had never been an attempt at permanent leverage. And historians would later note that this restraint did more to legitimize a new order than any victory could have, because it demonstrated that humans were willing to relinquish advantage once autonomy was secured. And back on Earth, the population adjusted to a quieter tension, aware that the galaxy was watching how humans behaved after the threat passed, and Admiral Holt oversaw the gradual dismantling of wartime command structures, cautioning that preparedness must remain, but paranoia must not, while President Brooks addressed the world one final time on the matter, stating simply that humanity had not sought to rule the stars, only to ensure it would never be ruled without consent. And beyond Earth, former Assembly leaders faced public reckoning on their home worlds, some stepping aside peacefully, others resisting until replaced, and this accountability reshaped political cultures that had long relied on distance from consequence. And among alien species, debates raged about whether humanity had saved the galaxy from stagnation or endangered it by breaking a familiar order, a debate that itself symbolized a change, because disagreement no longer implied rebellion. And in the years that followed, new institutions emerged slowly, imperfect and diverse, built around shared standards rather than enforced hierarchies, and humanity took its place among them not as a master or a myth, but as a known quantity, respected for its willingness to endure pressure without surrendering agency, and a phrase that quietly entered galactic lexicon was not one of fear but caution, a reminder repeated in academies and councils alike that humans would cooperate, negotiate, and compromise, but that obedience could never again be assumed, because once, when the galaxy demanded submission, Earth had answered by striking the heart of an empire and proving that the future belonged not to those who commanded compliance, but to those who could survive without it.